Developing Pag-asa as a strategic forward operating base allows us to maintain presence, support joint mission, and respond when required. This directly advances our direction as a mission-oriented and capability-driven force. We build where mission demands it. We invest in systems that allow us to operate with consistency.
China has a fully armed military base sitting inside Philippine territorial waters. And for years, the Philippines could do almost nothing about it. No reliable runway. No way to fly in reinforcements. No way to move fast when it mattered. Just a crumbling grass strip on a tiny island, 270 nautical miles from the mainland, that turned to mud every time it rained. While Beijing built fighter jet runways, missile systems, and radar installations on Subi Reef, the Philippines watched from 12 nautical miles away and could barely land a cargo plane. That just changed. Two days ago, the Philippine Air Force completed and inaugurated a full basing support system on Pag-asa Island, a hardened runway, a new hangar, operational infrastructure built to sustain air operations in the most contested patch of ocean in Asia. For the first time, the Philippines has a real forward base staring directly back at China's most aggressive outpost in the Spratly Islands. This is what deterrence looks like when a smaller country decides it has run out of patience. Not long ago, Pag-asa's runway was an embarrassment. 850 meters of cracked, grassy strip that turned to mud every time it rained. Pilots needed 3 straight days of dry weather just to land a plane. The island had Filipino civilians living on it, military personnel defending it, and no reliable way to reach it by air. That changes now. The Philippine Air Force just completed a 3-kilometer concrete runway, a new hangar, a full basing support system built specifically to keep aircraft operational this far out in the South China Sea. "270 nautical miles from the Philippine mainland. The AFP confirmed it. 100% complete. Think about what that actually means. A C-130 can now land there. Supplies, troops, equipment, all of it can move faster, more reliably, and in worse weather than ever before. An island that used to be cut off is now connected. An outpost that was vulnerable is now a base. The Philippines spent years and billions of pesos getting here.
We are ready to prepare our assets in case we need to repatriate our Filipino nationals. This will be done in coordination actually with DFA, with the DMW and the DND.
P1, 65 billion earmarked in the 2025 national budget alone. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. Deliberate, expensive, and strategically timed. To understand why Pag-asa matters, you need to look at a map. Subi Reef sits southwest of Pag-asa Island. Distance between them, 12 nautical miles. That is inside Pag-asa's own 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Which means China didn't just build a military base in the South China Sea. China built a military base in the territorial waters of a Philippine island. And what did they build there? Not a fishing shelter, not a Coast Guard post. A fully militarized base, runways long enough for fighter jets, radar systems, hangars, anti-ship missiles.
The total reclaimed area within our EEZ and out of our EEZ, I could roughly around 3,000 hectares. This includes their major bases. This includes Subi Reef, which I would like to correct, is outside our EEZ, although it is 12 nautical miles, roughly 12 to 15 nautical miles from Pag-asa.
The Philippine Navy confirmed it in 2024. Subi Reef is fully militarized. Now picture this. A Philippine Air Force pilot takes off from the mainland, flies west for hours, and begins his descent toward Pag-asa. He passes Subi Reef on the way in. Last August, Chinese forces on that reef fired 16 military flares at a Philippine patrol aircraft making that exact approach. 16. And then came the radio challenge. This is Chinese territory. Leave immediately. The pilot didn't leave. That's the reality on the ground. Every resupply flight, every patrol, every landing at Pag-asa happens in the shadow of a Chinese military installation that Beijing built illegally, that a 2016 international tribunal ruled against, and that China simply does not care about. The new runway doesn't make that threat disappear, but it means the Philippines now has something it didn't have before: the ability to show up, stay, and operate consistently, regardless of the weather, regardless of the radio challenges. Pag-asa alone doesn't deter China. But Pag-asa isn't alone. Look at what the Philippines has been building simultaneously. A military runway on Balabac Island in Palawan, one of the sites now accessible to U.S. forces under the expanded defense agreement between Manila and Washington. 9 EDCA bases across the Philippine archipelago, several of them in the north facing Taiwan, several in the west facing the South China Sea, and now a hardened airbase on Pag-asa, the furthest forward point in that entire network. This is distributed basing, and it's the exact strategy that keeps military planners in Beijing awake at night. Here's why. A single large base is a single target. You know where it is. You can plan around it. You can threaten it. But a network of smaller, dispersed bases, connected by runways, supply lines, and alliance agreements, is a completely different problem. To neutralize it, you have to hit everything at once. And every node you miss stays in the fight. Pag-asa is now that kind of node. It can receive aircraft. It can store supplies. It has a Coast Guard district base, a permanent marine garrison, a Navy vessel stationed offshore. The Philippines didn't just build a runway, they built a sustained presence platform 270 nautical miles into contested water. And the U.S. is watching closely. Because Balabac, Pag-asa, and the EDCA sites don't just serve Philippine deterrence. They serve the broader Indo-Pacific logic. Keep the first island chain contested, keep Chinese power projection expensive, and keep allies in the fight before a crisis ever begins. Beijing understands this. That's exactly why the pressure hasn't stopped. Beijing didn't wait for the ribbon cutting to respond. The pressure has been constant, calculated, and deliberately kept just below the threshold of open conflict. Water cannons, laser strikes, military flares, radio challenges, ship rammings. China has been running a gray zone campaign around Pag-asa for years, and it escalated sharply as Philippine construction accelerated. In October 2025, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel rammed and water cannoned a Philippine fisheries ship less than 2 nautical miles from Pag-asa Island.
CCJ 5 o'clock on water cannon.
2 nautical miles, well inside the island's territorial sea. This wasn't an accident of navigation. This was a message, delivered in the form of a ship collision, sent directly to Manila. The message: infrastructure doesn't change sovereignty. But here's what China's gray zone campaign actually reveals. If the construction on Pag-asa didn't matter, Beijing wouldn't bother. You don't fire 16 military flares at a cargo plane unless that cargo plane threatens you. You don't ram fishing vessels in someone else's territorial waters unless you're trying to intimidate them into stopping something. The intensity of China's response is itself a measure of how much the Philippine buildup is working. There's a pattern here that runs across the entire West Philippine Sea. Every time the Philippines moves, resupply mission, construction project, patrol flight, China applies pressure. And every time the Philippines absorbs that pressure and continues anyway, the deterrence argument gets stronger. Not because the Philippines can match China militarily, but because it keeps proving that the cost of coercion keeps rising. Pag-asa's new runway didn't provoke China. It answered a threat that was already there. Here is the legal reality that sits underneath everything happening at Pag-asa.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act. It is a time for cool heads.
In 2016, an international arbitral tribunal in The Hague ruled decisively against China's 9-dash line. It struck down Beijing's sweeping claims over the South China Sea, including its claim over Pag-asa Island. The ruling was clear. The Philippines has sovereign rights here. China's occupation of Subi Reef, its harassment of Philippine vessels, its radio challenges to incoming aircraft, all of it happens in waters that international law says belong to Manila. China's response to that ruling was one word: no. Beijing called it a piece of paper. It ignored the tribunal completely and kept building, kept militarizing, kept pushing. But here's why the legal dimension still matters strategically. It matters because of who is watching. Every ally in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, the United States, anchors its South China Sea position on UNCLOS. Every freedom of navigation operation the U.S. Navy runs through these waters cites that 2016 ruling. Every joint patrol between Philippine and American vessels operates under the logic that international law is worth defending with hardware, not just words. When the Philippines builds on Pag-asa, it isn't just pouring concrete. It is making a physical argument. It is saying that a ruling backed by international law will be backed by a runway, a hangar, a garrison, and an air force. That sovereignty isn't just a legal claim sitting in a document in The Hague, it is 3 kilometers of concrete in the middle of the South China Sea, with aircraft on it. China can challenge every inbound flight. It cannot change what that runway represents. The South China Sea has always been a competition between facts on the water and facts on paper. China understood that early and spent a decade turning reefs into islands, islands into bases, and bases into military fortresses. The Philippines watched it happen from 270 nautical miles away, on a grass strip that turned to mud in the rain. But something shifted. Manila stopped protesting and started building. And what just opened on Pag-asa Island 2 days ago is the clearest signal yet. The Philippines is not ceding this ocean one rainstorm at a time. The question now isn't whether the runway is complete. It is. The question is what comes next: logistics, stronger alliance integration, or a Chinese escalation that tests everything Manila just built. This story is not over. It is just getting to the part that matters. If you want to follow how the Indo-Pacific's most active flashpoint develops, the bases, the alliances, the gray zone pressure, and the strategy behind all of it, subscribe to Indo-Pacific Report. This is exactly what we cover. Every week. No noise, just the story.
The Philippines is positioning itself as a key link in global supply chains with a proposed high-tech industrial hub in Luzon under a new plan with the United States.
A factory floor in the Netherlands. It looks like something out of a science fiction film. Clean rooms the size of football fields. Workers in full bodysuits. Machines the size of small houses that took decades and billions of dollars to build, doing something no other machine on Earth can do. Printing circuits onto silicon at a scale smaller than a virus. This is ASML, the Dutch company that manufactures extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. The only machines in the world capable of making the most advanced semiconductor chips. ASML makes roughly 50 of these machines per year. Every cutting-edge chip in your phone, your laptop, every AI data center in the world, it ran through a machine made in Veldhoven, the Netherlands. There is exactly one company in the world that can build them. China has been trying to get its hands on these machines for over a decade. Washington has been preventing that transfer for nearly as long. And in December 2025, the United States formalized what had been a loose network of export controls and bilateral agreements into something far more deliberate, far more ambitious, and far more consequential. They named it Pax Silica. On April 17, 2026, the Philippines just signed on. Welcome to the Indo-Pacific Report. What you're about to hear is not just a trade story. This is the architecture of the next world order. And Luzon just became its first construction site. To understand what happened in Manila, you need to go back about 35 years. Around 1990, Deng Xiaoping, the architect of China's modern economy, reportedly made an observation that the Chinese state has quietly built its entire resource strategy around ever since. The quote, often attributed to him, goes something like this: "The Middle East has oil. China has rare earths." He was right. China today controls approximately 60% of the world's rare earth production, and over 85% of its processing capacity. These are the elements, neodymium, terbium, dysprosium, that go into electric motors, wind turbines, military guidance systems, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. You cannot build a chip fab without them. You cannot build an advanced military without them. For 30 years, the global technology industry looked at this concentration and shrugged. Efficiency was the principle. China was cheap, fast, and integrated. Why duplicate what already existed? Then COVID happened. Semiconductor shortages shut down car factories in Michigan and electronics assembly in Taiwan. Supply chains that had been optimized for calm weather shattered in the first real storm. And Washington finally started asking, what happens if this disruption is not an accident, but a choice? Jacob Hellberg, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs and the chief architect of Pag-asa, put it plainly. If the 20th century ran on oil and steel, the 21st century runs on compute and the minerals that feed it. Whoever controls the semiconductor supply chain, the minerals, the manufacturing equipment, the chip design, the fabrication, the packaging, controls the foundational infrastructure of artificial intelligence. And whoever controls AI controls the economy, the military, and the political leverage of the next 50 years. This is the world Pag-asa was built to shape. This is the question worth sitting with. Why the Philippines? The standard answer is geography. Luzon sits at the northern end of the Philippine archipelago, directly astride the shipping lanes connecting Northeast Asian manufacturing hubs, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, with the Indian Ocean and the global market. It is geographically central to the Indo-Pacific in a way that very few locations are. But geography alone doesn't explain this. The more precise answer is that the Philippines has a long, underappreciated history in the global electronics supply chain. The country is already a significant producer of semiconductors and electronics. Manila and its surrounding regions have hosted electronics assembly and packaging operations for decades. The workforce is young. The Philippines has one of the youngest median ages in Southeast Asia, technically capable and English-speaking. Labor costs remain competitive relative to East Asian manufacturing centers. The State Department's announcement was explicit about this. It described the Philippines as a nation that brings to Pag-asa key capabilities and human talent in technology manufacturing, including semiconductors and electronics. There is also the geopolitical dimension, and it cannot be understated. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States under the Mutual Defense Treaty. The Luzon Economic Corridor already exists as a trilateral U.S.-Japan-Philippines infrastructure investment framework. Both Washington and Tokyo have been systematically building out this corridor for precisely the reason that it provides economic and strategic depth inside the first island chain, close enough to the South China Sea to matter, allied enough to be trusted. Let's talk about what a 4,000-acre industrial zone actually means, because the numbers are easy to say and hard to visualize. 4,000 acres is roughly 1,620 hectares, larger than many mid-sized cities. The announcement describes it as an economic security zone, a new designation that doesn't yet exist in Philippine law but is being created specifically for this purpose. The phrase AI native in the official description is significant. This is not a repurposed 1990s export processing zone being dressed up with new language. The intent is to design this facility from the ground up around the infrastructure demands of the AI era: power generation, data center capacity, cooling, precision manufacturing, and logistics. The site is intended to serve as a staging point for a purpose-built platform for allied manufacturing, an investment acceleration hub where the specific industrial activities are shaped by market demand, host country comparative advantages, and the evolving needs of the Pag-asa network. More importantly, the State Department described the Luzon hub as explicitly the rest of many. This interconnection can transform Pag-asa industrial policy from a collection of bilateral projects into a genuine system capable of competing with and ultimately displacing the concentrated supply chains on which the world currently depends. That last phrase is the most important one. This is not a hedge against Chinese supply chain dominance. It is an attempt to replace it. The Atlantic Council, in analysis published just 2 days ago, noted that for Pag-asa to succeed, it will need more than hubs. It will need skilled worker mobility agreements, mutual recognition of technical credentials, and jointly funded workforce training programs. The hardware is necessary, but so is the human capital to run it. The Philippines, with its 115 million people and expanding technical education sector, is being positioned to supply a significant share of that capital. Now let's hear what the other side is saying. Because China is paying attention. Chinese analysts, including those writing for the Global Times, have been notably blunt in their assessment of Pag-asa. One industry expert summarized the critique this way: the move is essentially aimed at decoupling from China in the global semiconductor supply chain, and it is unlikely to succeed due to China's deep level of integration. The deeper concern, expressed by multiple analysts, is that fragmenting the semiconductor supply chain will raise costs, reduce economies of scale, and create economic friction that ultimately harms everyone, including Pag-asa members. Deng Xiaoping's rare earth leverage was built over 3 decades of patient accumulation. The United States is now attempting to build a counter-architecture in a fraction of that time. Whether they can move fast enough is the central question. Here is the larger frame. What we are living through right now is the end of a 30-year era. The era that began when the Berlin Wall fell, when the assumption was that economic integration would soften geopolitical competition. That trade would replace conflict. That interdependence was strength. That assumption is dead. The CHIPS Act killed it. Pag-asa buried it. The Luzon Economic Security Zone is building on top of it. What is replacing it is something we don't have a fully clean name for yet. Call it allied industrial statecraft. The deliberate coordination of manufacturing capacity, supply chain geography, and investment oaths among a coalition of countries that have decided, collectively, that economic security and national security are the same thing. And the Philippines is now formally part of this new architecture, not as a passive recipient of American military hardware, but as a co-constructor of the economic order that will determine who wins the AI century. The question for you is this: can a coalition of 13 nations coordinating across manufacturing, minerals, compute, and logistics actually build something fast enough and resilient enough to challenge an integrated supply chain that China has spent 40 years constructing? Or is this another well-designed alliance that moves too slowly against a competitor that moves without deliberation? Drop your answer in the comments. If you want to be the person in the room who actually understands what is happening in the Indo-Pacific, subscribe to this channel. We cover the moves the headlines miss. See you in the next one.
Over TBDs, and we are proceeding based on our plan.
The Philippine Maritime Zones Act and the Philippines Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act. With these pieces of legislation, we align our domestic laws with international law, specifically the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UNCLOS.
There's an island at the bottom edge of the Philippines that most Filipinos have never visited. Most couldn't point to it on a map. It sits so far south that Malaysia is closer than Manila. The waters around it are turquoise. The mountains are untouched. For decades, it had one identity, forgotten. That identity just died. Because right now, on that island, construction crews are building a 3-kilometer military runway. Warehouses are going up. Barracks are being erected. Structures that the Philippine military says have not been made public and probably never will be. And American soldiers, though you won't see them, are already there, embedded so deeply into the planning that their presence is felt in every decision being made. The island is called Balabac. And what's happening there is not a local construction project. It's the opening move in a chess game being played between Washington, Beijing, and Manila, over a narrow strip of water that most of the world has never heard of. But that could determine who controls the most contested sea on Earth. This is that story. To understand why Balabac matters, you first have to understand where it is. And where it is, that's the whole point. Balabac sits at the absolute southwestern tip of the Philippine province of Palawan. Palawan itself is often called the country's last ecological frontier, a long, narrow island stretching like a nungar toward Borneo. Balabac is the Enger tip. Below it, just across a 50-kilometer wide strait, lies Malaysia. To the west is the South China Sea. To the east is the Sulu Sea. Now picture that geography for a moment. If you wanted to sail a warship from the South China Sea into the Sulu Sea, or the other way around, without going hundreds of kilometers out of your way, you would pass through the Balabac Strait. It is one of only a handful of narrow passages that connect these two bodies of water. And that makes it, in military terms, a choke point. Since at least 2019, Chinese warships have been transiting through Balabac Strait repeatedly and often without notifying Manila. We're not talking about Xing boats or Coast Guard cutters. We're talking about People's Liberation Army Navy destroyers. Frigates. Replenishment oilers. In one documented case, even China's aircraft carrier passed through Philippine archipelagic waters using the Balabac Strait Sibutu Passage route. Between February and August 2019 alone, at least 14 Chinese warships transited through Philippine waters using this corridor.
1600 lang. Yes, sir.
Many of them turned to their automatic identification system transponders, the electronic beacons that allow coastal states to track vessel movements. Some refused to identify themselves when challenged by Philippine Navy ships.
4 Chinese Army warships were spotted 12 nautical miles off Palawan Wednesday. The Philippine military says the vessels were all headed southwest of the Balabac Strait.
In June 2024, the AFP confirmed that 4 Chinese naval vessels, 2 destroyers, a frigate, and a replenishment oiler were spotted moving through Balabac Strait. The Philippine military challenged them. The ships responded. But the message was clear. China treats this waterway as a highway it can use at will. And the thing is, the Philippines had very little ability to do anything about it. Balabac was remote, underfunded. The nearest major military facility was far to the north in Puerto Princesa. There was a small naval station on the island, Naval Station Narciso del Rosario, but it was minimal. No runway, no significant surveillance capability, no meaningful deterrent. In strategic terms, presence is everything. And for decades, the Philippines simply wasn't present. To understand the military buildup on Balabac, you need to understand 4 letters. EDCA.
The entire trip is what they're saying in many areas. In Japan, there's always been an agreement. It's there, it exists. And this is an important, that handshake, that signing, that ceremony, as simple as it may seem.
The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed in 2014 between the Philippines and the United States. It is not a basing agreement. EDCA does not give the U.S. permanent military bases on Philippine soil. What it does is allow American forces to rotate through designated Philippine military installations on a temporary basis.
These windows will fall behind halfway of this door, okay? On the front end, that's going to be our section.
They can preposition equipment. They can build facilities. They can conduct joint exercises. But the bases remain under Philippine sovereignty and control. When EDCA was signed under President Aquino, base sites were designated: Basa Air Base in Pampanga, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Antonio Bautista Air Base in Palawan, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro.
Where I had a constructive exchange with, amongst others, Acting Head of State and Senate President Hun Sen.
Then, in April 2023, President Marcos approved 4 additional sites, bringing the total to 9. And one of those 4 new sites was Balabac Island. Now here's the detail that matters most. Balabac is the only EDCA site directly adjacent to the South China Sea. The 3 other new sites, Naval Base Camilo Ocias and Lalo Airport in Cagayan Province, and Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Isabela, are all in the northern Philippines, positioned closer to Taiwan and the Luzon Strait. They face a direct strategic direction. But Balabac faces west. It faces the contested waters where China and the Philippines clash almost daily. And it sits right on top of the choke point that Chinese warships have been using to move between seas. That positioning is not accidental.
To intensify our ISO, internal security operation, to end insurgency and attain victory. Leadership.
The former AFP Chief of Staff, General Andres Centino, visited the island in May strategic, emphasizing the need to detect foreign and friendly vessels transiting between the South China Sea and the Sulu Sea. The infrastructure plan reacts that priority. A 3-kilometer dual-use military runway, construction began in 2019, funded under a partnership between the Department of National Defense and the Department of Public Works, is designed to allow surveillance aircraft to detect intrusions in strategic maritime routes. Beyond the runway, there are plans for a command and control building, a humanitarian assistance and disaster relief warehouse, barracks, and upgrades to Naval Station Narciso del Rosario, including a new beaching ramp and pier. And then there are the structures the military says will never be made public. The Americans, meanwhile, are already embedded in the planning. Joint exercises, shared intelligence, rotational troop deployments. The U.S. military footprint on Balabac may not be visible to the naked eye, but it is woven into the operational fabric. As one reporter on the ground put it, they may not be that visible, but they are felt deeply in all aspects of planning. But the Philippines isn't just building bases. It's rewriting the legal architecture of its waters. And Balabac sits right at the center of that too.
Today we gather for the signing of 2 very significant laws that emphasize the importance of our maritime and archipelagic identity. The Philippine Maritime Zones Act and the Philippines Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act.
On November 8, 2024, President Marcos signed into law 2 landmark pieces of legislation: the Philippine Maritime Zones Act and the Philippine Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act. The Maritime Zones Act formally deems the Philippines' internal waters, archipelagic waters, territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf, all in compliance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This matters because for decades, despite the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling that rejected China's sweeping 9-line claims, the Philippines had never formally codied its own maritime boundaries into domestic law. The Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act goes further. It designates exactly 3 sea lanes through which foreign military vessels and aircraft may exercise passage through Philippine archipelagic waters. One of those 3 lanes runs directly through the Balabac Strait, Salib Sea, through the Basilan Strait, across the Sulu Sea, through the Nasubata Channel, and out through the Balabac Strait into the South China Sea. Outside these 3 designated lanes, foreign warships are now restricted to innocent passage, a much more limited right under international law that prohibits lingering, prohibits weapons exercises, and can even be suspended by the coastal state for national security reasons. The implications are enormous. Before this law, Chinese warships could arguably transit through any customary route in Philippine waters. Now, the Philippines has legal grounds to restrict, regulate, and challenge any passage outside the 3 designated corridors. China's reaction was immediate. Within hours of Marcos signing the laws, Beijing summoned the Philippine ambassador to lay a stern protest.
The Philippine Maritime Zones Act and the Philippines Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act. With these pieces of legislation, we align our domestic laws with international law, specifically the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UNCLOS.
But the Philippines didn't back down. Marcos said the laws demonstrate the country's commitment to uphold a rules-based international order. And Senator Francis Tolentino, who championed the legislation, noted that while China might not recognize the laws, the imprimatur from the international community would strengthen our position. Balabac is no longer just a military base. It is now a legally forded choke point, a place where Philippine sovereignty is both physically and legally asserted. Let's zoom out, because you cannot understand what's happening on Balabac without understanding what's happening across the wider South China Sea. The South China Sea carries more than $3 trillion in annual trade. It is claimed in overlapping fashion by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. But China's claims are the most expansive and the most contested. Beijing asserts sovereignty over virtually the entire sea under its so-called 9-line, a claim that the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in 2016 has no legal basis under international law. China rejected the ruling. And since then, it has only intensified its presence. Artificial islands have been built and militarized. Missile systems installed. Airstrips constructed. The Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia maintain constant pressure on Philippine vessels, using water cannons, blocking resupply missions, and in one alarming incident in March 2026, aiming re-control radar at a Philippine naval vessel near Sabina Shoal. This is what strategists call gray zone warfare. Not open conflict, but not peace either. A relentless incremental squeeze designed to establish control without ever crossing the threshold. That would trigger a military response. And here's what connects it directly to Balabac. China views the EDCA expansion, particularly the sites in Palawan and the northern Philippines, as a direct threat. Beijing's former ambassador to Manila, Huang Xilian, warned that the U.S. intends to take advantage of the new EDCA sites to interfere in the situation across the Taiwan Strait and advance its anti-China agenda at the expense of peace and development of the Philippines.
Right there! Right in front of me! I just shot him!
China's concern isn't unfounded from its own strategic perspective. A military runway on Balabac capable of launching surveillance aircraft means the Philippines, and by extension, the United States, can monitor every Chinese naval movement through the strait. Combined with the new Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act, it means Manila now has both the legal authority and the physical capability to challenge Chinese transits that don't conform to Philippine regulations. For Beijing, Balabac isn't just another Philippine military project. It's a door closing on a corridor it has used freely for years. In all of this, the warships, the runways, the legal frameworks, the great power rivalry, there are people living on Balabac who simply want electricity that works, roads that don't ood, schools that have enough teachers, and a future their children can see themselves in. For the residents of Balabac, the military buildup carries a cautious kind of hope. Activity means jobs. Construction means infrastructure. A runway means connectivity, heights that could link the world to the rest of the Philippines. We also need change, specifically for the youth, one resident said, so we can also improve for the next generation so we don't get left behind. That's the voice that often gets drowned out in geopolitical analysis. But it's the voice that matters most, because every military base sits on somebody's home. Every strategic choke point is also somebody's shin ground. And the people of Balabac, who lived for decades at the margins of national attention, are now watching their island become the center of a story they didn't choose. Their message to those in power is simple, and it deserves to be heard. Whatever strategy is drawn, whatever alliances are forged, whatever forces are deployed, the Philippines and its people must always come first. If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion.
China is accelerating its nuclear buildup at a pace that is also reshaping the global balance of power, it seems.
It is the first time that China has so clearly stated its military plans and ambitions in the last 2 years, and it is focusing its attention far at sea, far from its shores.
I mean, China has grown the islands 2,000 acres in the last 18 months. That's a lot of space that they've grown. They're throwing sand up into these atolls and then building military airstrips on top of those.
What if the next major global crisis doesn't begin with a missile launch, but with concrete being poured onto tiny reefs in the middle of the sea? That question suddenly feels a lot less hypothetical this week. Fresh satellite images and defense assessments show that China is steadily expanding military infrastructure across several artificial islands in the South China Sea, facilities analysts say could support advanced missile systems and potentially nuclear-capable strategic assets. For most people scrolling through the news, it might sound like just another geopolitical headline. But look a little closer, and it feels different. Bigger. Almost like watching pieces of a much larger chessboard quietly fall into place. And here's the unsettling part. The South China Sea doesn't look dramatic on a map. Just scattered reefs, shallow waters, and a few tiny specks of land. Yet every year, roughly $3.37 trillion worth of global trade moves through these waters. Oil tankers, cargo ships, energy routes, an entire artery of the global economy flows through this stretch of ocean. If something goes wrong here, it doesn't stay regional for long. It ripples outward, touching supply chains, energy markets, and even grocery prices on the other side of the planet. Take Mischief Reef, for example. A decade ago, it was little more than a submerged coral formation. Fishermen passed by it without thinking twice. Today, it has long airstrips, hardened shelters, radar systems, and missile-capable facilities. The transformation is so dramatic that one Southeast Asian naval officer once joked privately that a reef turned into an aircraft carrier. Except, it wasn't really a joke. This is where the tension begins to feel personal for the region. China's sweeping claim to most of the South China Sea, marked by the now famous 9-dash line, overlaps directly with the maritime zones of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. For fishermen, coast guards, and naval patrols operating there, the dispute isn't theoretical. It's something they encounter face to face on the water, sometimes intense standoffs, sometimes with water cannons, warning shots, or aggressive maneuvering between vessels. Meanwhile, outside powers are stepping in more frequently. The United States and its partners regularly conduct freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships through contested waters to challenge what they see as excessive maritime claims. Every patrol, every flyover, every radar lock adds another layer of friction to an already crowded strategic space. As Admiral John Aquilino, the commander of United States Indo-Pacific Command, once put it bluntly, the South China Sea is not just a regional issue, it's a global concern with implications for freedom of navigation and international law. And that's really the heart of the story. Because what's unfolding in the South China Sea isn't simply about islands or even military bases. It's about who sets the rules in one of the world's most important waterways. It's about whether international law still holds weight when major powers disagree. And increasingly, it's about whether a quiet competition for strategic dominance might one day turn into something much harder to contain. So the real question isn't just what China is building in the South China Sea. The bigger question is what it might be preparing for and how the rest of the region and the world will respond. The South China Sea sits at the crossroads of geography, commerce, and power. On the map, it may appear like a wide stretch of blue connecting Southeast Asia to the Pacific. But in reality, it functions as one of the world's most important maritime highways. Every day, enormous container ships and oil tankers move through these waters, linking the factories of East Asia with the markets of Europe and the energy producers of the Middle East. It is difficult to exaggerate how vital this route has become to the global economy. Entire supply chains depend on it. A disruption here would not just affect nearby countries, it would echo across global markets almost immediately. But trade routes are only one part of the story. Beneath the seabed of the South China Sea lies another powerful incentive that keeps regional tensions simmering: natural resources. Energy assessments suggest that the seabed may contain around 11 billion barrels of oil and nearly 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. For countries with fast-growing economies and rising energy demands, those numbers are hard to ignore. Control over even a portion of these resources could reshape national energy strategies and reduce dependence on foreign imports. In many ways, the sea is not just a waterway, it is also a potential energy reserve waiting beneath layers of sediment. Then there is the human dimension, which often gets overlooked in high-level strategic debates. The South China Sea is one of the most productive fishing grounds on Earth, supplying roughly 10 to 12% of the global fish catch. Millions of people across Southeast Asia depend on these waters for their livelihoods. For coastal communities in places like Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, fishing here is not about geopolitics, it is about daily survival. Yet fishermen often find themselves on the front lines of maritime disputes, encountering foreign coast guards, maritime militias, or naval patrols in increasingly crowded waters. The roots of the territorial dispute stretch back decades. China's sweeping claim over most of the South China Sea is illustrated through the so-called 9-dash line, a boundary that first appeared on Chinese maps in the late 1940s. Beijing argues that this line reflects historical rights and centuries of Chinese activity in the region. However, several Southeast Asian countries strongly reject that interpretation. Instead, they base their claims on modern international maritime law, particularly the framework established under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines exclusive economic zones extending 200 nautical miles from coastal states.
The new government here in Manila is grappling with what might be called catastrophic success. What comes next is obviously going to be a delicate balancing act. It is a time for cool heads.
The legal clash between historical claims and international law came to a dramatic moment in 2016. That year, an international tribunal under the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled overwhelmingly in favor of the Philippines in a case challenging China's maritime claims. The decision concluded that the 9-dash line had no legal basis under international law, and that many of the disputed features could not generate expansive maritime zones. Beijing, however, rejected the ruling outright and has continued to assert its position, creating a situation where legal interpretation and geopolitical reality remain deeply at odds. While legal debates continue, developments on the ground, or more precisely, on the water, have moved forward rapidly. Over the past decade, China has carried out extensive land reclamation projects across several reefs and shoals in both the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. What were once scattered coral outcrops have been transformed into large artificial islands with runways long enough for military aircraft, deep water ports capable of hosting naval vessels, and sophisticated radar installations. These facilities are not merely symbolic outposts. They represent a permanent and expanding military footprint in the region. Alongside the infrastructure has come a steady deployment of military assets. Fighter jets, surface-to-air missile systems, and naval patrol vessels have been observed operating from several of these installations. From a strategic perspective, these bases extend China's surveillance and operational reach across much of the South China Sea. If you zoom in on recent satellite imagery of the South China Sea, something striking appears. Reefs that once barely broke the surface of the water now look like small military cities. Concrete runways stretch across artificial islands. Radar towers stand like watchful sentries. And deep water harbors are carved into places that not long ago were just coral formations surrounded by fishermen's boats. Over the past few years, China has quietly but steadily expanded these installations, turning them into some of the most strategically positioned military outposts in the region. Two of the most significant locations are Fiery Cross Reef and Subi Reef. What used to be isolated reefs have been transformed into heavily fortified bases with long airstrips, hardened shelters, and large infrastructure capable of supporting sustained military operations. Analysts studying satellite imagery say some of the newly reinforced structures appear designed to store or deploy advanced missile systems, including platforms capable of carrying nuclear-capable intermediate-range missiles. In several images released in recent years, thick concrete facilities and underground-style structures suggest preparations for assets that require both protection and rapid launch capability. The expansion has not been limited to building new bases. China has also been upgrading facilities that were already operational. Runways have been extended and strengthened so they can accommodate larger aircraft, while port facilities have been expanded to handle bigger warships. The effect is noticeable when you look at the scale of these installations today. They are no longer simple forward outposts, but rather fully functioning military hubs. Surveillance technology has also become a central feature of these bases. Advanced radar systems, high-altitude drones, and increasingly sophisticated monitoring tools now allow Chinese forces to observe vast portions of the surrounding sea and airspace. A particularly important node in this surveillance network is the growing military complex on Hainan Island. Located at the northern edge of the South China Sea, the island has long served as a key base for China's naval and air forces. Recent upgrades have added powerful radar installations capable of scanning hundreds of kilometers across the region. In practical terms, that means aircraft movements, naval patrols, and even routine shipping activity can be tracked with far greater precision than before. For strategists, that kind of visibility dramatically strengthens situational awareness in contested waters. Alongside infrastructure expansion has come a clear push to strengthen naval and air capabilities operating in the area. China has deployed increasingly advanced platforms, including the Type 093 submarine, which enhances underwater deterrence and patrol capacity. Surface operations have also grown more prominent with the presence of the aircraft carrier Shandong, capable of projecting air power far from the mainland. In the skies above the region, China's fifth-generation Chengdu J-20 fighter jets represent another step toward modernizing the country's military reach. Military activity itself has also intensified. Exercises in the region have become more frequent and more complex, often involving coordinated naval and air maneuvers. Some drills reportedly simulate scenarios involving potential confrontation with outside powers, particularly the United States, whose naval forces regularly operate in nearby waters. These exercises serve multiple purposes. They train Chinese forces for high-intensity operations, signal strategic resolve to rivals, and demonstrate China's growing ability to project power across one of the world's most contested maritime regions. Taken together, these developments suggest something larger than routine military modernization. They point to a deliberate effort to build a network of forward positions capable of monitoring, controlling, and if necessary, defending China's interests across the South China Sea. For countries in the region, and for global powers watching closely, the question is no longer whether China is strengthening its presence there. The real debate now centers on how far that expansion might go, and what it could mean for the balance of power in Asia's most strategically sensitive waters. When you step back and look at the scale of China's construction across the South China Sea, it's hard not to ask the obvious question: why invest so much in remote reefs and contested waters? The answer isn't just about territory. It's about influence, security, and the long game of global power. For Beijing, these islands are not random military outposts. They are strategic footholds in one of the most important maritime regions on Earth. One of the clearest motivations is regional power projection. The South China Sea has increasingly become a stage where major powers signal strength and resolve. For China, expanding military facilities there allows it to extend its defensive perimeter far beyond the mainland coastline. From Beijing's perspective, this helps counterbalance the presence of foreign naval forces that regularly operate in the region. Warships from the United States and its allies conduct patrols meant to challenge expansive maritime claims, and Chinese strategists see forward bases as a way to maintain constant visibility and, if necessary, deterrence against those movements. At the same time, these installations reinforce China's territorial claims. The scattered reefs and islands of the South China Sea may appear insignificant individually, but collectively they shape control over vast surrounding waters. Another powerful driver is economic security. China is the world's largest energy importer, and much of that energy flows through the sea lanes that cut across the South China Sea. Tankers carrying crude oil from the Middle East and Africa travel along these routes before reaching Chinese ports. Analysts often note that roughly 70% of China's imported oil passes through these waters, making them one of the country's most critical supply arteries. From Beijing's standpoint, ensuring that these shipping lanes remain secure, especially during geopolitical crises, is a matter of national survival. Beneath the sea itself lies yet another strategic prize. Geological surveys suggest that the seabed may hold substantial deposits of oil, natural gas, and potentially rare earth minerals. Control over these resources would strengthen China's long-term energy security while reducing vulnerability to external suppliers. In an era where energy access often shapes geopolitical competition, the prospect of untapped reserves beneath the South China Sea adds another layer of strategic urgency to the dispute. Domestic politics also plays a role in shaping China's approach. The leadership of the Chinese Communist Party places strong emphasis on national unity, sovereignty, and the idea of restoring China's historical status as a major power. Demonstrating control over disputed maritime territories fits naturally into that narrative. Military modernization, visible through advanced aircraft, naval deployments, and fortified island bases, reinforces the image of a country that has regained both confidence and capability on the global stage. For Chinese leadership, a stronger military presence in the region also serves as a message to domestic audiences. It signals that the government is actively protecting national interests and responding to external pressures. In that sense, infrastructure projects in distant reefs become symbols of national strength as much as they are strategic assets. This connection between military strength and national development has been openly emphasized by Xi Jinping, who has repeatedly linked defense modernization with China's broader rise as a global power. As he stated in 2019, a strong military underpins China's peaceful rise. The remark captures a central idea in Beijing's strategic thinking. Stability and prosperity, in China's view, depend on the ability to defend national interests with credible power. Seen through that lens, the expansion in the South China Sea is not an isolated policy. It is part of a broader strategy aimed at securing vital trade routes, reinforcing territorial claims, and projecting influence across the Indo-Pacific. Whether this approach will stabilize the region or deepen strategic rivalry, however, remains one of the most pressing questions shaping the future of Asian security. As China's military footprint across the South China Sea has expanded, reactions from the rest of the region have been immediate and sometimes uneasy. Countries in Southeast Asia are watching developments closely because the dispute isn't happening somewhere far away. It's unfolding right on their maritime doorstep. For several members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the growing presence of Chinese bases has triggered a mix of diplomatic protest, cautious dialogue, and quiet military preparation. Governments across the region have repeatedly called for negotiations and adherence to international maritime law. Yet behind the scenes, many are also strengthening their own security capabilities. Vietnam, for instance, has steadily expanded and modernized its Coast Guard and naval patrol capacity, aiming to better monitor its maritime zones. The Philippines has taken a slightly different route by deepening defense cooperation with the United States, allowing greater coordination between the two militaries in response to growing tensions in disputed waters. For smaller states, the challenge is delicate. They must defend their maritime rights while avoiding escalation with a far more powerful neighbor. Outside powers have also become increasingly involved. The United States, which sees the South China Sea as vital to global maritime freedom, continues to conduct freedom of navigation operations to challenge what it considers excessive territorial claims. American naval deployments in the region often operate alongside partners such as Japan and Australia, signaling that the issue is no longer purely regional, but part of a broader Indo-Pacific security landscape. One notable example came in 2023, when the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan sailed through the South China Sea as part of a broader show of deterrence and reassurance to allies. These patrols and exercises increasingly intersect with emerging security frameworks like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, commonly known as the Quad, which brings together the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. Although the Quad is not a formal military alliance, its growing cooperation in maritime security reflects a shared concern about maintaining open sea lanes and balancing China's expanding influence. At the legal level, international institutions have attempted to provide a framework for managing these disputes. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea remains the primary legal basis for defining maritime rights and exclusive economic zones. In theory, it offers a clear structure for resolving overlapping claims. In practice, however, enforcement remains difficult when major powers reject rulings or interpret legal provisions differently. As international law expert Philippe Sands once observed, international law is clear, but compliance remains a challenge. His remark captures the frustrating gap between legal principles and geopolitical realities. The developments unfolding in the South China Sea illustrate how geography, economics, and power politics can intersect in ways that shape global security. China's expanding military presence, including infrastructure capable of supporting advanced missile systems, reflects a strategy driven by regional influence, protection of vital trade routes, and domestic political considerations. For neighboring states and global powers alike, the implications are far-reaching. Security dynamics are shifting. Economic stability is potentially at stake. and diplomatic relationships across the Indo-Pacific are being recalibrated in response to these changes. None of these developments exist in isolation. Each is part of a larger strategic transformation underway in the region. For now, the South China Sea remains one of the defining geopolitical hotspots of the 21st century. What happens there will not only influence the security architecture of Asia, but also shape the broader dynamics of global power in the decades ahead. If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion. We cannot afford to be blind in our own waters. That was how one Philippine defense official reportedly framed it this week, and honestly, that line hits hard. Because here's the real question. What happens when the world's most contested waters sit right at your doorstep? Do you stay quiet and hope the storm passes? Or do you finally decide to anchor yourself firmly in the middle of it? This week, the Philippines chose the second option. In the latest move that's sending ripples across the Indo-Pacific, Manila inaugurated the Mahatao Forward Operating Base near the Luzon Strait, that narrow, deep water corridor between Luzon and Taiwan where global trade ships pass silently by day and warships glide through at night. It's not just another base. It's a statement, a very deliberate one. The Luzon Strait isn't some random patch of blue on the map. It connects the South China Sea to the open Pacific. Oil tankers, container ships, submarines, aircraft carriers, they all move through this space. If tensions ever spiral in the Taiwan Strait, this passage becomes critical in hours, not days. Think of it like a highway interchange during rush hour. Whoever controls visibility and access there doesn't just monitor traffic, they shape it. And for years, the Philippines has watched this corridor from a distance. Sometimes cautiously, sometimes nervously. But things have changed. China's growing naval footprint in the South China Sea, from Coast Guard deployments to gray zone pressure tactics, has pushed Manila into a different strategic mindset. This isn't the Philippines of a decade ago, hedging quietly. This is a country recalibrating its defense posture in real time. Mahatao, located in Batanes province, sits almost at the northern edge of the Philippine archipelago. On a clear day, locals say you can almost feel how close Taiwan is. Fishermen there have long understood that geography is destiny. Now, that understanding has turned into infrastructure. This new facility strengthens maritime domain awareness. It improves response times. It deepens coordination with allies, particularly the United States and Japan, who see the Luzon Strait as a strategic artery in any regional contingency. And yes, it signals to Beijing that Manila is no longer comfortable playing the peripheral actor. There's something human about this shift too. For decades, the Philippines has balanced between asserting sovereignty and avoiding escalation. It has tried dialogue. It has absorbed pressure. It has tested accommodation. But deterrence, real, visible deterrence, requires presence. And presence requires steel, radar, runways, and resolve. This isn't about provocation. It's about positioning. The inauguration of the Mahatao Forward Operating Base marks more than a construction milestone. It marks a psychological shift. A country that once hesitated is now preparing. A maritime state is finally reinforcing its northern gate. So the real question isn't whether this base changes the strategic equation. It already does. The deeper question is whether this move stabilizes a fragile balance in the Indo-Pacific or pushes the region one step closer to something far more kinetic. Either way, the Luzon Strait just got a lot more consequential. Before we get lost in strategy and headlines, It helps to pause and look at the map. Geography has a way of explaining politics better than any press conference ever could. The Luzon Strait lies between Luzon in the Philippines and Taiwan, stretching roughly 250 kilometers across. On paper, it's just a body of water. In reality, it's a narrow gateway connecting the South China Sea to the Western Pacific. That alone makes it powerful. It's one of those places that doesn't make noise, but quietly shapes outcomes. Every day, massive cargo ships pass through that corridor carrying energy supplies, electronics, food, and everything in between. It's a commercial lifeline for East Asia. Beneath those waters run undersea communication cables, the hidden system that keeps financial markets, military communications, and internet traffic alive across the region. Most people never think about those cables. But if they were disrupted, the consequences would be immediate and widespread. Then there's the military dimension, and this is where the Luzon Strait becomes even more consequential. Naval forces moving from the South China Sea into the Pacific, including submarines, often pass through this corridor. Its position makes it an ideal monitoring point. Whoever can observe activity there gains early warning. And in strategic terms, early warning is everything. Geography here isn't passive. It's leverage. Now place that geography inside today's security environment.
Starboard cup.
Tensions between Manila and Beijing have steadily intensified over the South China Sea. Disputes around Scarborough Shoal and the Spratly Islands are no longer abstract diplomatic disagreements. They play out at sea, often involving direct encounters between vessels. Chinese Coast Guard ships have been recorded operating as close as 43 kilometers from the Philippine coastline. That proximity shifts the psychological landscape. It no longer feels distant or theoretical. It feels immediate. At the same time, China has increased its naval and air activity in and around the Taiwan Strait. Exercises such as Strait Thunder 2025A may be framed as routine drills. But from Manila's perspective, they signal a rising tempo of military preparedness in its near periphery. When major power competition intensifies just north and west of your territory, you don't have the luxury of detachment. This broader environment has shaped Philippine defense policy in noticeable ways. For decades, the armed forces of the Philippines focused largely on internal security challenges. External defense modernization moved slowly. That trajectory has changed. The acquisition of the BrahMos anti-ship missile system was a clear pivot toward deterrence by denial. The ability to impose costs on hostile naval forces operating near Philippine waters. Additional investments, including guided missile corvettes and surveillance upgrades, reinforce this shift toward building credible maritime defense capability. Alliances have also regained strategic weight. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States is no longer treated as symbolic architecture from the Cold War era. It has evolved into an operational framework with expanded exercises, planning coordination, and defense dialogues. Interoperability is no longer aspirational, it is being institutionalized. Seen together, geography, rising regional tensions, and a modernization drive converge into a single logic. The Luzon Strait is not a peripheral space. It is a strategic hinge. And in a moment when the Indo-Pacific balance feels increasingly fragile, hinges become focal points. If geography sets the stage, this base is the entrance cue. On August 28, 2025, the Philippines inaugurated the Mahatao Forward Operating Base in Mahatao, Batanes, the northernmost province of the Philippines. It sits roughly 120 miles south of Taiwan. That distance might sound comfortable on paper. It isn't. In strategic terms, that's close. Very close. Batanes itself feels remote. Windswept hills, dramatic coastlines, small communities used to typhoons and isolation. But that remoteness is precisely why it matters. From this position, you're at the gateway to the South China Sea, and just beside the Bashi Channel, a deep-water corridor submarines and naval vessels used to move between enclosed seas and the open Pacific. It's not flashy territory. It's consequential territory. And here's the thing. This base isn't symbolic. It's functional. Operationally, it hosts units under the Northern Luzon Naval Command and a Marine Battalion landing team. That combination matters. Naval presence provides maritime reach, Marine forces add rapid response and expeditionary capability. Together, they create a forward posture rather than a reactive one. In practical terms, that means quicker deployment timelines, better coordination, and fewer blind spots. The infrastructure is designed to support maritime surveillance and logistics staging. Think sensors, mobility, supply chains. Not just watching the sea, but being ready to act if necessary. It allows for rapid projection of naval and marine assets into surrounding waters. And in deterrence strategy, readiness is the message. One of its core purposes is enhancing maritime domain awareness. The Luzon Strait is busy, strategically layered water. Monitoring vessel movements, tracking patterns, and distinguishing between routine transit and abnormal activity requires presence. You cannot manage what you cannot see. This base improves visibility, and visibility stabilizes decision-making. Then there's deterrence. And this is where the signal becomes unmistakable. Establishing a forward operating base this close to strategic transit routes demonstrates a commitment to defending sovereign waters and exclusive economic zones. It communicates preparedness without necessarily escalating. Presence, when calibrated, can reduce miscalculation. The base also serves a cooperative function. It is positioned to support joint exercises and interoperability with partners such as the United States, Japan, and Australia. In today's Indo-Pacific security architecture, coordination is as important as capability. Shared drills, logistics integration, and communication alignment reduce friction during crises. And it's not purely about conflict scenarios. The Philippines is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world. Typhoons, earthquakes, maritime accidents, they are recurring realities. A forward base in Batangas can also function as a humanitarian staging point. That dual-use dimension matters. Disaster response strengthens public legitimacy. What makes Mahatao significant isn't just its hardware, it's the strategic shift it represents. For years, the northern frontier of the Philippines was quiet, important, but underdeveloped in military terms. That is no longer the case. This is forward defense thinking. This is geographic realism translated into infrastructure. And in a region where timing and positioning define outcomes, positioning this far north changes the board. This is where things get real, because a base isn't just concrete and radar systems. It's a signal, and signals travel fast in the Indo-Pacific. For Manila, the most immediate implication is territorial security. The northern maritime frontier has historically been quieter than the South China Sea flashpoints. But quieter doesn't mean safer. With a forward operating base in Mahatao, the Philippines can now project a defensive presence into waters that were previously monitored at a distance. That shortens response time. It strengthens patrol coverage. It shifts posture from reactive to anticipatory. And that matters. There's also the surveillance dimension. Enhanced monitoring through the Luzon Strait supports broader efforts to protect marine resources and uphold maritime law. Illegal fishing, unauthorized transits, gray zone activities, these are persistent challenges. Surveillance isn't just about warships, it's about governance. It's about demonstrating that maritime zones aren't empty spaces, but regulated ones. If you zoom out, this is a country that spent decades underinvesting in external defense. Now it's correcting that imbalance. Slowly, but deliberately. From Beijing's perspective, the equation looks different. The establishment of a forward base so close to strategic transit routes signals Manila's intent to deter further coercive pressure. It reinforces the reality that the Philippines is deepening defense coordination with partners across the Indo-Pacific. That alignment, whether through exercises, intelligence sharing, or access arrangements, alters the operational landscape. China may interpret the move as part of a broader containment arc supported by the United States and regional partners. Even if Manila frames the base as sovereign self-defense, which it is, perception shapes reaction. And in strategic competition, perception often matters as much as capability. The concern in Beijing will not simply be the base itself. It will be what the base represents. A Philippines less hesitant to assert maritime rights and more integrated into allied security planning. At the regional level, the implications extend beyond bilateral tensions. The Luzon Strait sits along critical sea lanes that underpin regional trade and energy flows. A more robust Philippine posture contributes to stability in that corridor by improving monitoring and response capabilities. Stability here is not abstract. It affects shipping insurance rates, energy security, and crisis management timelines. The base also strengthens collective deterrence. Security in the Indo-Pacific increasingly relies on networked partnerships rather than isolated alliances. Bilateral dialogues, multilateral naval exercises, interoperability frameworks, these mechanisms reduce the risk of miscalculation by clarifying commitments and capabilities. In theory, credible deterrence lowers the probability of conflict. In practice, it requires careful calibration. Too little presence invites pressure. Too much visibility risks escalation. The Philippines is attempting to strike that balance, asserting sovereignty while avoiding provocation. And that balancing act will define whether the Mahatao Forward Operating Base becomes a stabilizing anchor or another focal point in an already crowded strategic theater. Either way, the northern edge of the Philippines is no longer peripheral. It's central to the evolving security architecture of the Indo-Pacific. The moment a base like this opens, the reaction doesn't stay local. It travels through diplomatic cables, defense briefings, media headlines, and quiet strategic calculations. From Washington's side, support has been direct and consistent. The United States has reaffirmed expanded defense cooperation with the Philippines, including longer operational schedules and deeper planning dialogues. The tone has been firm but measured, emphasizing alliance commitments while framing activities as defensive and stabilizing. There's also the hardware dimension. Plans involving systems such as the Typhoon missile system reflect a layered deterrence approach. Philippine officials have repeatedly described these deployments as purely defensive, intended to strengthen readiness, not provoke confrontation. Still, the symbolism is powerful. Advanced capabilities positioned near a major maritime choke point are impossible to ignore. From Beijing's perspective, skepticism is almost guaranteed. China is likely to interpret the expansion of infrastructure and allied coordination near the Luzon Strait as part of a broader strategic alignment aimed at constraining its maneuver space. Increased militarization near critical waterways, especially those connected to the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, touches directly on China's core security concerns. Even if Manila frames its actions as sovereign self-defense, Beijing will analyze them through the lens of regional power balance. And in great power politics, perception often moves faster than reassurance. The Luzon Strait development fits into a broader pattern of quiet rebalancing across the Indo-Pacific. Countries are modernizing, partnerships are deepening, yet almost everyone is trying to avoid open escalation. It's a delicate equilibrium, strategic hedging in motion. Opening a forward base is one thing, sustaining it is another. Batan's is geographically remote. Supply chains are longer. Weather conditions can be unforgiving. Maintaining year-round operational readiness in such a location requires consistent logistics planning, infrastructure resilience, and financial commitment. A forward posture only works if it's sustainable. There's also diplomatic sensitivity. China remains a major economic partner for the Philippines. Trade, investment, tourism, these ties don't disappear because of security tensions. Manila must navigate defense strengthening while managing economic interdependence. That balance is complex and sometimes uncomfortable. And domestically, defense expansion must coexist with development priorities. Infrastructure, poverty alleviation, disaster resilience, these remain pressing national concerns. Strategic modernization cannot appear detached from public welfare. It has to be framed and implemented as part of a broader national security concept that includes economic stability and humanitarian readiness. Strategic clarity is important. So is political calibration. The Mahatao Forward Operating Base marks a watershed moment in Philippine defense strategy. It enhances maritime domain awareness. It strengthens deterrence along a critical northern frontier. And it reinforces alliance networks in an Indo-Pacific environment defined by intensified power competition. As tensions continue to evolve around the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, the Philippines is signaling a shift from reactive posture to proactive defense planning, from peripheral observer to engaged stakeholder in regional security architecture. More than concrete and command posts, the base represents strategic foresight. It reflects a recognition that geography cannot be changed, but preparedness can. In the end, Mahatao is not just about positioning forces. It is about positioning the Philippines within the evolving balance of power, asserting sovereignty, strengthening partnerships, and navigating deterrence without surrendering stability. If you found this analysis valuable, share your perspective in the comments. Your insights help deepen the conversation and sharpen our understanding of evolving regional dynamics. Thank you, and we will see you soon in our next geopolitical discussion.
Ready!
What does it mean when a country does not host permanent foreign bases, yet suddenly opens 9 strategic doors to the world's most powerful military? And more importantly, why now? In early 2023, Manila and Washington quietly crossed a threshold that had been avoided for decades. 4 new locations were added under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, lifting U.S. access from 5 to 9 Philippine sites. No fanfare, no base building ceremonies, just a map that suddenly looked very different and far more consequential. Picture the geography for a second. Northern Luzon sits within reach of the Taiwan Strait. Palawan faces the South China Sea head-on. These are not abstract points on a strategist's slide. They are fishing grounds, runways, coastal towns, and supply routes that Filipinos live with every day. When access was extended to Naval Base Camilo Osius, Lalo Airport, Camp Melchor de la Cruz, and Balabac Island, the message was not theoretical. It was geographic. These sites sit astride the corridors through which any Taiwan contingency or South China Sea crisis would inevitably flow. To understand the weight of this move, comparison matters. Japan hosts large, permanent U.S. bases, fixed, visible, and politically entrenched. South Korea does the same, anchored by the Korean Peninsula's unresolved war. Australia, by contrast, favors rotational access and logistics hubs spread across vast distances. The Philippines has chosen a fourth model: strategic access without permanent basing. No flags lowered, no sovereignty ceded.
Left or right lateral limit is your individual target. So yung lateral limit,
Yet in practical terms, the United States can now pre-position equipment, rotate forces, and operate from locations that sit closer to potential flashpoints than almost any other allied territory. This is not a sudden pivot pulled from thin air. It rests on a long memory. The 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty established the alliance when Asia was still reeling from World War II. EDCA, signed in 2014, modernized that framework for an era of gray zone coercion, missile ranges, and maritime pressure. What changed in 2023 was urgency. China's activities in the West Philippine Sea intensified. Taiwan's security calculus hardened. And Manila reached a sober conclusion shared quietly across Southeast Asia. Geography does not allow neutrality on paper to function in practice. At its core, this expansion is less about America coming back, and more about the Philippines deciding where it stands in an increasingly crowded Indo-Pacific chessboard. These sites are not just runways and ports. They are signals to allies seeking reassurance, to competitors testing limits, and to Filipinos themselves, weighing security against history. The question now is no longer why the doors were opened. It is how this new posture reshapes deterrence, diplomacy, and daily life along the region's most contested waters. The U.S.-Philippines alliance is not a sudden convenience. It is a relationship shaped by memory, sacrifice, and shared threat perception. In 1951, with Asia still recovering from World War II and the Cold War hardening, Manila and Washington signed the Mutual Defense Treaty. For decades, that treaty was not just ink on paper, it was a reality. American aircraft took off daily from Clark Air Base, and U.S. naval power flowed through Subic Bay, once the largest American overseas base in the world. These installations brought security, jobs, and a visible U.S. footprint, but they also carried political weight and historical baggage tied to colonial memory and national pride. By the early 1990s, the mood had changed. The Cold War was ending, Mount Pinatubo had devastated Clark, and Filipinos were asking hard questions about sovereignty and self-reliance. When the Philippine Senate voted against renewing base leases in 1991, it was not an anti-American moment. It was a declaration of independence in strategic terms. The closures in 1992 marked a psychological turning point. The alliance would continue, but on new terms, shaped more by Filipino consent than Cold War necessity. What followed was not a divorce, but a quieter, more deliberate partnership. Without permanent bases, cooperation had to adapt. The Visiting Forces Agreement restored the legal foundation for joint exercises, disaster response, and counterterrorism operations, allowing U.S. troops to come and go, but never stay. It was a model built on presence without permanence, familiarity without occupation. That logic deepened with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. EDCA reflected a new reality. Threats no longer came as massed armies, but as maritime coercion, gray zone pressure, and rapid crises. Instead of bases flying foreign flags, the agreement focused on rotational access, pre-positioned equipment, and joint infrastructure inside Philippine camps. In human terms, it was a compromise, maintaining alliance credibility while respecting the hard-won lesson of the 1990s. Filipinos want partners, not landlords.
This is a JP, all right? This equipment is ready to go.
This evolution explains why today's EDCA expansion feels both dramatic and familiar. It is not a return to the past, nor a break from it. It is the alliance, reshaped by history, geography, and a shared understanding that in the Indo-Pacific, distance is shrinking, and time to react is measured in hours, not decades. At its core, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement is a workaround shaped by history. After the Philippines shut down permanent U.S. bases in the 1990s, both sides needed a way to keep the alliance credible without reopening old wounds. EDCA does exactly that. It allows U.S. forces to rotate in and out, bring equipment when needed, and help fund upgrades inside Philippine military facilities, while ownership, command, and ultimate control remain firmly with Manila. No foreign flags, no permanent barracks, no transfer of sovereignty. In practical terms, it is access without occupation, presence without permanence. What makes EDCA politically survivable in the Philippines is what it explicitly forbids: permanent U.S. bases. Every activity happens inside Philippine camps, under Philippine authority. That distinction may sound technical, but domestically it matters a lot. It is the difference between partnership and dependency, between cooperation and control. When EDCA was first implemented, 5 sites were selected, not randomly, but because they quietly reflected the Philippines' real security needs. Pag-asa Air Base anchors air defense near Metro Manila. Fort Magsaysay, the country's largest military reservation, supports large-scale ground and joint exercises. Lumbia Airport strengthens its reach into Mindanao, long shaped by counterterrorism and disaster response. Antonio Bautista Air Base faces the West Philippine Sea directly, while Mactan Benito Ebuan Air Base serves as a central logistics and air mobility hub. These sites told a story even back then. EDCA was not about one enemy or one scenario. It was about flexibility, covering Luzon, the Visayas, Mindanao, and the country's most exposed maritime flank.
EDCA is often misunderstood as a war-fighting agreement alone.
In reality, its scope is broader and more human. One pillar is interoperability, making sure Filipino and American forces can actually operate together in real crises, not just on paper. Another is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, a critical need in one of the world's most disaster-prone countries, where typhoons arrive more reliably than geopolitics. At the same time, EDCA quietly fixes things militaries need but rarely talk about publicly: longer runways, hardened hangars, fuel storage, and logistics nodes. These upgrades serve Philippine forces first, but they also ensure that if a regional crisis erupts, at sea or in the air, response time is measured in hours, not weeks. Seen this way, EDCA is less about preparing for war and more about not being caught unprepared.
It reflects a shared judgment by Manila and Washington that in today's Indo-Pacific, deterrence, disaster response, and credibility all start with one basic question: can you move fast enough when it matters? In February 2023,
what better example of that Filipino nobility of spirit could there be than what was once again demonstrated in the last worldwide crisis, where our men and women rose to the challenge of facing an unseen enemy, a new global challenge.
President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. signed off on 4 additional EDCA locations, and the timing mattered. This was not a routine bureaucratic update. It came as pressure mounted in the South China Sea. Military flights around Taiwan increased, and regional planners began asking uncomfortable questions about response time. The rationale was simple and sober. Geography leaves little margin for delay. By widening access points, the Philippines reduced its strategic blind spots and signaled that deterrence starts with being in the right place before a crisis breaks out.
Located at the northern tip of Luzon, Naval Base Camilo Osias looks directly toward Taiwan across the Luzon Strait. This is not symbolic positioning, it is operational reality. Any air or naval movement between the Pacific and the South China Sea passes nearby. Access here shortens reaction time and strengthens maritime awareness in a corridor planners quietly describe as unavoidable in a Taiwan contingency. Lalo Airport adds air mobility to the northern equation. Its value lies in speed, the ability to move personnel, equipment, and relief supplies quickly into northern Luzon. In military terms, it supports rapid deployment. In civilian terms, it doubles as a lifeline when disasters hit a region often exposed to typhoons. Dual use is not an afterthought here, it is the point. Set inland in northeastern Luzon, Camp Melchor de la Cruz anchors the eastern defense posture. It provides depth, space to stage, train, and sustain operations away from the coast. Strategically, it connects northern access points with central Luzon, ensuring that defense planning is not compressed into a narrow coastal strip. Perhaps the most geopolitically sensitive site, Balabac Island sits near some of the South China Sea's most contested waters and critical sea lanes. Control of awareness here matters not just for military operations, but for trade routes that carry energy and goods across Southeast Asia. From Balabac, the map stops being abstract and starts looking like daily reality for fishermen, patrol crews, and shipping traffic. These 4 sites tell a clear story. They are not clustered, not redundant, and not accidental. They form a quiet arc, from Taiwan-facing waters in the north to contested sea lanes in the west, designed to give the Philippines and its allies options instead of ultimatums. In today's Indo-Pacific, that flexibility is not escalation, it is insurance. At the strategic level, EDCA is less about troop numbers and more about signaling. By dispersing access across multiple locations, the alliance complicates adversary planning at a time of rising Taiwan Strait. Deterrence today is conveyed through positioning and readiness, not rhetoric. The intent, repeatedly emphasized by U.S. officials, is prevention, discouraging crises before they erupt, rather than responding after lives are already at risk. EDCA's impact is most visible during joint exercises. Drills such as Balakatan now use EDCA sites to practice amphibious, air assault, coastal defense, and rapid logistics operations. Filipino and U.S. forces train as integrated units, building habits and trust under realistic conditions. Infrastructure is the quiet backbone of the agreement. By the end of FY 2023, the United States had planned over $100 million in upgrades across EDCA locations, runways, fuel storage, hardened facilities, and logistics hubs. These improvements remain with the armed forces of the Philippines and deliver civilian benefits as well, from local jobs to faster disaster response. A runway built for military transport is the same runway that receives relief aircraft after typhoons. Equally important is what EDCA is not. There are no permanent U.S. bases, no exclusive zones, and no foreign command. Forces rotate, equipment moves, and sovereignty stays with Manila. Officials on both sides consistently stress this point because it goes to the core of national dignity. As briefings often state, these are Philippine bases, first and last. Inside the Philippines, EDCA has never been a purely military discussion. It is a deeply emotional one. Supporters within the defense establishment argue that access agreements are a practical response to a harsher security environment, not a surrender of sovereignty. Critics, however, see a familiar risk: entanglement in conflicts that Filipinos did not choose, particularly scenarios involving Taiwan or great power rivalry. Civil society groups and activists have called for stronger legislative oversight and broader public debate, reflecting a national instinct shaped by history. Alliances are acceptable, but only when autonomy is visibly protected. This tension is not weakness. It is a democracy negotiating its own red lines. For Manila, the alliance with the United States is not just about deterrence. It is about catching up. The armed forces of the Philippines have long faced capability gaps compared to regional peers, especially in air defense, maritime awareness, and joint operations. Deeper engagement brings exposure to advanced training, modern logistics that would take decades to develop alone. For many policymakers, EDCA is less about choosing sides and more about ensuring the country is not strategically naked in an unforgiving neighborhood. From Washington's perspective, the EDCA expansion fits squarely within its broader Indo-Pacific strategy: deter coercion, uphold maritime norms, and reassure allies that U.S. commitments are not seasonal. Beijing's reaction has been consistent and sharp. Chinese officials have criticized EDCA expansions as containment under another name, warning that they risk militarizing the region and undermining peace. State media has framed the sites as potential triggers in a crisis, even as Manila and Washington stress their defensive and humanitarian purpose. The contrast highlights a deeper divide. While China views expanded access through a zero-sum lens, the Philippines frames it as insurance against uncertainty, not preparation for confrontation. Across Southeast Asia, reactions have been quieter but no less attentive. Fellow ASEAN members are watching closely, aware that what happens in the Philippines could shape norms for the entire region. Many governments share the same balancing instinct: maintain economic ties with China, preserve security cooperation with the United States, and avoid being forced into binary choices. Publicly, the emphasis remains on peace, stability, and freedom of navigation, language that reflects both caution and realism. Beyond Southeast Asia, the EDCA expansion has reassured other U.S. allies. Partners such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia see the move as confirmation that alliance networks in Asia are tightening, not fraying. In a region where credibility is measured by presence, EDCA sends a quiet but unmistakable message. Coordination is deepening, not retreating. For ordinary Filipinos, EDCA's most immediate relevance may have nothing to do with war. The country sits squarely in the path of typhoons, earthquakes, and volcanic activity. EDCA sites provide staging grounds for rapid humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Airfields that can receive heavy-lift aircraft, storage for emergency supplies, and logistics hubs that cut response times when hours matter. In past disasters, delays cost lives. Planners see EDCA as a way to make "never again" more than a slogan.
If I can, up on top of these hills, around 600 meters.
Beyond national borders, these sites enhance cooperation in search and rescue, environmental response, and regional emergency coordination. Oil spills, maritime accidents, and large-scale evacuations do not respect sovereignty lines. EDCA's dual-use nature allows military coordination to support civilian outcomes, quietly reinforcing stability without escalation. Despite official assurances, concerns persist at the local level. Some community leaders worry that foreign troop rotations could bring security risks, political backlash, or make their areas symbolic targets. Even when sovereignty is legally intact, perception matters. Managing local consent remains one of EDCA's most delicate challenges. Sites near Taiwan and contested maritime zones inevitably attract scrutiny. Critics argue that proximity itself creates risk, that in a major power confrontation, geography could pull the Philippines into events beyond its control. Supporters counter that absence of preparation would be even more dangerous. This debate cuts to the heart of national strategy, whether distance or readiness offers greater safety. Perhaps the hardest task is diplomatic. China remains one of the Philippines' largest trading partners and an unavoidable economic actor. Manila must walk a narrow path, deepening security ties with Washington while keeping channels with Beijing functional. EDCA does not eliminate this balancing act, it sharpens it. The addition of 4 new EDCA sites marks a decisive moment in the U.S.-Philippines defense cooperation. It strengthens deterrence, improves preparedness, and expands the alliance's ability to respond to both security crises and natural disasters. As great power competition continues to shape the Indo-Pacific, EDCA will remain central to how the Philippines protects itself without surrendering autonomy. The agreement is no longer just a legal framework. It is a living test of alliance management in a contested region. Ultimately, EDCA tells a broader story. Long-standing alliances do not stay frozen in time, they adapt. In the Philippines' case, that adaptation blends strategic realism with historical memory, seeking protection without submission, partnership without permanence, and stability in a region where uncertainty is the only constant. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
Developing Pag-asa as a strategic forward operating base allows us to maintain presence, support joint mission, and respond when required. This directly advances our direction as a mission-oriented and capability-driven force. We build where mission demands it. We invest in systems that allow us to operate with consistency.
China has a fully armed military base sitting inside Philippine territorial waters. And for years, the Philippines could do almost nothing about it. No reliable runway. No way to fly in reinforcements. No way to move fast when it mattered. Just a crumbling grass strip on a tiny island, 270 nautical miles from the mainland, that turned to mud every time it rained. While Beijing built fighter jet runways, missile systems, and radar installations on Subi Reef, the Philippines watched from 12 nautical miles away and could barely land a cargo plane. That just changed. Two days ago, the Philippine Air Force completed and inaugurated a full basing support system on Pag-asa Island, a hardened runway, a new hangar, operational infrastructure built to sustain air operations in the most contested patch of ocean in Asia. For the first time, the Philippines has a real forward base staring directly back at China's most aggressive outpost in the Spratly Islands. This is what deterrence looks like when a smaller country decides it has run out of patience. Not long ago, Pag-asa's runway was an embarrassment. 850 meters of cracked, grassy strip that turned to mud every time it rained. Pilots needed 3 straight days of dry weather just to land a plane. The island had Filipino civilians living on it, military personnel defending it, and no reliable way to reach it by air. That changes now. The Philippine Air Force just completed a 3-kilometer concrete runway, a new hangar, a full basing support system built specifically to keep aircraft operational this far out in the South China Sea. "270 nautical miles from the Philippine mainland. The AFP confirmed it. 100% complete. Think about what that actually means. A C-130 can now land there. Supplies, troops, equipment, all of it can move faster, more reliably, and in worse weather than ever before. An island that used to be cut off is now connected. An outpost that was vulnerable is now a base. The Philippines spent years and billions of pesos getting here.
We are ready to prepare our assets in case we need to repatriate our Filipino nationals. This will be done in coordination actually with DFA, with the DMW and the DND.
P1, 65 billion earmarked in the 2025 national budget alone. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. Deliberate, expensive, and strategically timed.
understand why Pag-asa matters, you need to look at a map. Subi Reef sits southwest of Pag-asa Island. Distance between them, 12 nautical miles. That is inside Pag-asa's own 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Which means China didn't just build a military base in the South China Sea. China built a military base in the territorial waters of a Philippine island. And what did they build there? Not a fishing shelter, not a Coast Guard post. A fully militarized base, runways long enough for fighter jets, radar systems, hangars, anti-ship missiles.
The total reclaimed area within our EEZ and out of our EEZ, I could roughly around 3,000 hectares. This includes their major bases. This includes Subi Reef, which I would like to correct, is outside our EEZ, although it is 12 nautical miles, roughly 12 to 15 nautical miles from Pag-asa.
The Philippine Navy confirmed it in 2024. Subi Reef is